he had this sense, this realization that just as he was hospitalized and in bandages, the Torah was somehow hospitalized and in bandages, and that when he was going to leave the hospital, he had to bring the Torah out of its bandages and into the light of the world. He's very concerned that the state of Israel is often thought of in religious terms that are fully disconnected from its reality. The fact that the state of Israel and the government of Israel function like any government means that talking with the state of Israel as the embodiment of the Davidic dynasty or the Malchut Yisrael, right, Jewish kingship, something like that, at the very least, grates and is a contradiction. He would say that you're not looking at reality.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. We live in times in which, I believe, we in the Orthodox world need to open ourselves to new ideas and new thinking that will help enhance our love and appreciation for God and His Torah. Maybe the best example of a contemporary thinker who has opened the doors of perception while remaining fully committed to Torah, halacha, the Jewish people, and the land of Israel is Rabbi Shimon Gershon Rosenberg Zatzal, colloquially known as Rav Shagar. I spoke with Rabbi Zachary Truboff and Yehoshua Engelman about Rav Shagar in episode 133 over 2 years ago. Today, as a special Chanukah presentation, I'm honored to speak with Rabbi Levi Morrow about Rav Shagar. Rabbi Morrow recently published Living Time, Festival Discourses for the Present Age, which is an English-language collection of some of Rav Shagar's essays on the Jewish holidays. Because both he and I have found that some of Rav Shagar's most impactful writing was on the subject of Chanukah, I was excited to speak to Levi about Rav Shagar's philosophy in general and to learn from him about some of Rav Shagar's ideas regarding Chanukah. Among the topics we addressed are the difference between the human and the divine viewpoints, why some people don't relate to Rav Shagar's philosophy, the importance of choosing to be religious rather than being compelled by facts, and why this existential choice is essential to our religious identity, how Rav Shagar understands the concept of religious obligation, his embracing of contradiction, whether we should be critical of those who leave Judaism, or if we need to respect that choice as well, if there is a place for interfaith dialogue or learning about other religions, whether Rav Shagar should be thought of as a religious Zionist thinker, with a capital R, and what he might think about the state of Israel today, if Rav Shagar believed that the state of Israel has religious value, and if so, whether the state is also part of the redemption, what he might say about the reality of Israel today, and more. Of course, we also dealt with Chanukah, specifically how the Shabbat candles and Chanukah candles represent two types of holiness, meaningfulness and fulfillment on the one hand, versus sacrifice without any obvious meaning on the other. The candle of the commandment along with the candle of the human soul. The ways that mitzvot contain divine light, but also that the earthly vessels of the mitzvot are even holier than the light they contain. The ways that the mitzvot don't come from divine wisdom, but from divine will, and what that means. What we mean when we say that God is beyond human categories, the relationship between Torah and the outside world and outside ideas, and the way that translation is a valuable method for bringing outside ideas into Torah thought. This is not a typical episode of the podcast. For those, however, who are looking for new approaches that are grounded in our sources, but which also deal forthrightly with the challenges Orthodox Jews face today, it offers a different perspective that hopefully you'll find very meaningful. Perhaps most crucially, it opens up the possibility that others will also forge new Torah paths that forthrightly deal with reality as it is, not as we wish it were. We'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Levi Morrow is a teacher, writer, and translator, and he is currently writing his PhD dissertation on Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's political theology at Hebrew University. He received his smicha from the Shehabar Sephardic Center in the Old City of Jerusalem, before which he also studied at Yeshivat Oraita and Har Etzion. Levi wrote his MA thesis on Rav Shagar while studying at Tel Aviv University, and he translated a collection of Rav Shagar's holiday drashot entitled Living Time. He is a research fellow at both the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center and the Shalom Hartman Institute. Levi teaches Jewish philosophy in Jerusalem, where he lives with his wife and their 3 children. Rabbi Levi Morrow, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Khan, for inviting me. I'm very excited for our conversation.
So am I. I am someone who has learned recently how important Rav Shagar is to Orthodox Jewish thought. When I say recently, I mean over the past 10 years. I grew up much more in the world of Rav Soloveitchik, and over the past years, Rav Shagar's thinking has had a profound effect on the way that I see the world. I'd like to ask you, as somebody who has been intimately involved in translating and thinking about Rav Shagar, what does Rav Shagar offer contemporary Orthodox Jews that they may not find in other modern Jewish thinkers? Why, that is, should thinking Jews learn the works of Rav Shagar?
It's a very good question. And the first thing I always say is that Rav Shagar might not be for everyone. That's a real possibility. But I do think there's something to offer everyone. And I think there are some people for whom Rav Shagar is not just available and has something to contribute, but it may even be very necessary.
Why is that?
Because the one of the thing that brought me to Rav Shagar is his association with the word postmodernism. I had a couple of teachers in my undergrad studies at Mechlelet Yaakov Herzog, a religious teaching college, who mentioned Rav Shagar as the only only rabbi to really grapple with postmodernism. And the only thing I knew about postmodernism is that rabbis don't like it. So I was curious. I had to check it out. His association with postmodernism comes from his sense that the world changes over time, that things shift in general. And, in some ways, the student of Rav Kook, that God's hand is revealed in history. The world changes, and we need to not change with it per se, but learn how Judaism can speak to the world as it shifts. And so, something I felt to some degree, I don't think I felt that Judaism was a state of crisis because it wasn't speaking to the modern world or something like that. But when I first read Rav Shagar, I suddenly felt like there was reading a teacher who spoke my language. That just the very way he spoke and the his Hebrew, but the way his Hebrew combines, say, Torah and philosophy and theory, made what sense to me. It really clicked. And so I think there are people who will need that sense of Rav Shagar speaking their language or reading Torah that speaks their language, and I think they'll find that in Rav Shagar.
For myself, I actually came to postmodernism through Rav Shagar rather than the other way around. Could you explain, in very brief, I realize it's a big question, but could you give the rudimentary ideas behind postmodernism when you talk about that phrase? We hear it all the time. Could you say what at least Rav Shagar meant when he talked about postmodernism?
Yeah, so what Rav Shagar meant when he spoke about postmodernism is a good question, and he admits that it's a term that doesn't have a great definition and it's hard to define. So I'm going to give, say, 2 definitions. First is more than postmodernism, I'd say postmodernity, right? A sort of social situation that we're in at this point in history. And that he refers to it, uses the Hebrew term Hamered HaShafuf, the dispirited rebellion, a sense of that we've lost all the grand narratives that give history meaning, right? And grand narrative is a commonly thrown around term. Because the story we tell ourselves about where we come from and where we're going, we as individuals, and more importantly, we as Jewish people, we as humanity. And those we don't necessarily find as compelling as individual stories anymore. And so he thinks that's sort of a broad social phenomenon in postmodernity. And the other, and this is I think worth saying forthrightly, is that postmodernism, what is most commonly associated with people who use the term, which is mostly people who don't like postmodernism, is like nihilism. Is the claim that values aren't real, that you can't prove why one set of values is better than another. And Rav Shagar is willing to take that head on. His primary essay it deals with postmodernism. It's published in Hebrew as L'chayot B'Tzamud L'Ayin, in English in the 2017 Maggid volume Faith Shattered and Restored. It's called Living with Nothingness. He says that might be real. And in fact, there might be good theological, Kabbalistic reasons for thinking that we shouldn't take our own values to be some representative of the ultimate truth of reality, that God is just beyond any one set of values. So that's the other thing postmodernism is, or Shagar grapples with, is the claim that there are no real values. There's no good and bad that we can sort of point to, and we have to learn how to live within our own, sets of values, recognizing they're not ultimate. And Shagar thinks that can be a real religious position.
I know that Rav Shagar does mention that one of the big differences between postmodernism and a Kabbalistic viewpoint, but they also are similar, they're different but similar, is that they both deal with nothingness, but the difference is, as he puts it, the nothingness of the Kabbalist has a capital N, whereas the nothingness for the postmodernist has a lowercase n, meaning nothing for Kabbalists means something which is beyond our ability to think, rather than simply nihilism, there's nothing out there. The ayin of Kabbalists is divine. It's something which is only called ayin because it's a truth or a something which is too great to be in any category of somethingness.
Right. I would say that that is one of two differences he makes between the Hasidic and postmodern ayins, the nothingness. And I'll say that it functions similarly in both of them as a reason to be critical and to negate, right, and the your own values, to say, well, they're actually, these values aren't supreme, they don't accurately reflect reality, or something like that. But he says the difference for Kabbalah and Chassidut is that you don't take that perspective forever. That's not, in fact, a human viewpoint. That's a divine viewpoint. That it's important for us to be able to appropriate and take up and take that sort of critical distance from our own human perspective and recognize that's what it is, right? From a theological perspective, we are creatures, not creators, and that difference is important. But then we have to be able to come back to live within the world we live in, like live within the life that we live within our categories and experiences, that we're not meant to take the critical slash divine posture forever. There's some value to it. We always have to come back to real life.
In a lot of ways, I think that Rabbi Sachs, Zatzal, his understanding in the dignity of difference of on earth there are truths, plural, whereas in heaven there is truth, singular, in some ways echoes the same idea of Rav Shagar. Perhaps Rav Shagar wouldn't have put it in exactly those terms, but the way that that ayin with the capital N is manifest in our multifaceted, imperfect world is in different sort of ways, whereas ultimately there is a fundamental truth at the heart of it all. Whereas postmodernists who are not religious would say, no, there's nothing that's called truth. Truth doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think you're right that you end up in sort of a similar picture of human life and pluralism on Earth, and with differences in the theological claims about God. And I don't know if Rav Shagar would put it quite that way. There's a truth in heaven, something like that.
Okay, now there are a lot of people who are not enthralled with Rav Shagar's way of thinking. Can you talk a little bit about some of the reasons that people don't like this? Admittedly, they may not like postmodernism, but he is giving it a hechsher. He's giving it a divine imprint. So what do they have a problem with in his thinking?
Well, one is that, right? The fact that he's giving it a hechsher might just do the reverse to him, might take away his hechsher. So that's part of it. Another part of it is in talking postmodernism, he embraces subjectivity, saying things are subjective, including, I should note, he says the claim that everything is subjective is also necessarily subjective. He's honest and upfront about that. People don't like subjectivity. I think because it's sort of associated with wishy-washy, lack of commitment to things, that the idea is that only if something is quote unquote objective, meaning it somehow reflects the true nature of reality in a way anyone could figure out if they put their mind to it, that's something that's binding and obligatory. And Rav Shagar says we don't have access to that, right? Even if such a thing exists, it's just not something we have access to. And in this sense, he says the real religious value at the heart of postmodernism is humility, right? Is being humble and recognizing our real limits. He says that we have to understand that our sense of obligation and our beliefs are just that. They're beliefs and they're a sense of obligation, nothing you can point to out in the world. And he thinks that's incredible. One, he thinks it comes from the religious posture of humility, and also thinks that it means we can freely choose to be religious without feeling like we are compelled by facts to do so, as it were. Um, in this sense, is one of many ways I find him very similar to Rav Soloveitchik, who you mentioned before, and they would disagree on plenty, but they both emphasize what I might call existential choice, The idea of free choice as the basis of religion being something really important.
In that sense, how would Rav Shagar understand the concept of obligation, or what we call religiously ol malchut shamayim, the burden of the kingdom of heaven? How would he understand that if we take on religion as a free choice rather than as something which is imposed upon us from without?
So I'll say this, it gets to the ways in which this is another thing people may find frustrating about him, that he can contradict himself. He broadly is believes that reality and human nature contain contradictions, and better to embrace that contradiction than to pretend to paper over it. So in this context, he will sometimes talk about Kabbalat Omochut Shemayim as you choose to be a servant of God. You choose to take up the Torah and halacha as the, guiding stars of your life. And that's not because you had to, or you've proven that this is necessarily true. It's just your choice. But he will also sometimes talk about Kabbalah Ol Malchut Shemayim as what he calls in Hebrew Kabbalah Atzmit, self-acceptance. And this is a Kabbalah self-acceptance is a broad theme throughout his writings. Sometimes takes on a sort of therapeutic vein, he says. But in terms of like question of why be Jewish or what is Kabbalah Ol Malchut Shemayim, he says, well, you're Jewish. You were born into the Jewish people. You are part of a long history of the Jews and their relationship with the Torah that shapes you and makes Torah an important part of your life. You don't have to change from that. You don't have to prove why that's right. It's just who you are, and that's okay. You can just accept who you are.
I'll ask a very difficult question, and admittedly, I assume this is speculative. I don't know if he wrote about this. I don't know. We're about to enter Chanukah, which is a time when the Maccabim, the Hashmonaim, fought against assimilation. Wouldn't it be a natural assumption, however, that from Rav Shagar's works, if someone chooses to assimilate, that's a valid choice? I mean, if someone says, I want to be a Greek, or in modern terms, I want to join Christianity or Islam or another religion, if it really is a matter of accepting yourself and choosing yourself, how can we, objectively speaking, criticize that choice if someone chooses to do that? Or can we not?
Yeah, here too, he's relatively forthright. He says you can't, there is no objective basis where you could stand outside your own perspective and criticize someone else's perspective, right? To criticize a different perspective is always from your own perspective. So, again, published in Faith Shattered and Restored in English, but the original Hebrew is in his Hanukkah volume. In Hebrew, it's called Halacha, Halicha, Emunah. In English, Religious Life in the Modern Era. It's a great essay on halacha in the life of the modern Jew and the place of Emunah and all sorts of things. But he says there, he talks about non-Orthodox movements, but it would to some degree probably apply to people who assimilated as well. He says, like, but speaking of non-Orthodox Jews, he says they aren't Jews the way I'm looking to see Jews. They may have their own understanding of Judaism, and I can't critique that from my understanding of Judaism. All I can say is it doesn't match up to my understanding of Judaism. Now, that's not to say he wouldn't be critical, right? That is, he is in fact critical. And so another place an essay called Emunati, My Faith, he ends it by talking about, he says he doesn't understand like the existence, like what it would mean to talk about being Jewish in the absence of a really thick relationship with the Masorah, with the tradition. And so but he says when you critique someone outside, when you disagree with a different perspective, which you should do, you should affirm the things you think are right and disagree with things you think are wrong. You also have to simultaneously recognize that you're doing so from your perspective, not from some sort of objective, perspectiveless position.
Then did Rav Shagar believe in interfaith dialogue of a sort? As far as I understand, I don't even know if he ever left Israel. I think he entirely learned everything that he learned from Hebrew versions of the various philosophers that he learned. I don't think he knew other languages, or at least that's what I understand. Perhaps you can correct me about that. So I know that he was very insular in the sense of spending his whole life in Israel. But did he believe that it's worthwhile to speak to people outside of Israel, outside of the Jewish community?
Just to flesh out the picture you're painting, you're entirely correct about his sort of almost parochial perspective. That he comes very much from within Judaism to the degree that if there was another language he spoke or read, it was Yiddish. I've heard, I'm not sure if he spoke it, but definitely was able to read Yiddish. And the one time that I'm aware of he left Israel was when students convinced him to go to Eastern Europe to visit the Kavarim of different Hasidic Rebbeim. So he may be read a little bit in English, but not in any significant way. Anytime he's reading philosophy and citing philosophy things, it's all in Hebrew translation or Hebrew secondary literature. Um, he's not broadly interested in interfaith dialogue or something like that. By contrast, he was very close with Rav Menachem Froman, who was a big believer of grassroots peace activism here in Israel, specifically emphasizing religious interfaith, peace activism, and thought that like secular activism wasn't going to work. But for Rav Shagar, he has basically like one essay where he talks about interfaith, not even like dialogue with real people, just about learning about other religions and their relationship, like thinking that about through other religions from a Jewish perspective. And that has a lot to do with his students who were, as part of a rising trend of Israelis in general and religious Zionist students in specific, were post army going to India and like learning about Buddhism and Hinduism and things like that. And that's a much larger discussion. But for Rav Shagar, one of the questions he asks is, okay, so what does that do for Judaism? And as a Jew, when you learn about those things, should you be looking for similarities? Should you be looking for differences? And he does think there's value to learning about other religions because of the way it helps you better understand your Judaism, right? That to some degree, until you encounter something else, you'll never really reflect on Judaism. And then when you find something similar in another religion that's like slightly different, noticing that difference will help you realize the unique things about Judaism.
Would you say, Levi, that Rav Shagar would emphasize the concept of loyalty? The reason I'm asking this is that it sounds to me that from his philosophy, as we said before, it's impossible, as you mentioned, to really criticize someone outside of your own personal tradition. If somebody wants to leave the Jewish religion and join another one, there's no objective reason we can say he's wrong. The one thing I could argue, though, is that it's almost like loyalty to a spouse. If someone's loyal to one spouse, then even if there is another spouse potentially out there who is quote unquote better or different, it doesn't matter. You made a commitment. You have a covenant. Would you say that that is part of his thinking, that despite the fact that he's open to the idea that truth is subjective, we do have a concept of covenant and loyalty to the Jewish tradition, which should not be broken?
Yes and no. Meaning, I think he absolutely would agree with that. He sometimes uses the term loyalty, ne'emanut in Hebrew. He uses the term brit, covenant, a lot. Very strong believer in the idea that we have a brit, and that this goes back to self-acceptance, recognizing yourself as a member of the brit, recognizing yourself as having a sort of individual personal brit. But he would, I think, not necessarily. He doesn't speak of it in, it's like normative terms, in terms of like people who break the brit or don't have ne'emanut are doing something wrong, again, from like an external perspective. He says, yeah, he feels like obviously they're violating the Brit, no question. But again, that comes from sort of within his perspective.
I guess you can't get out of that.
Yeah, his an image I like. He talks about irony is an idea he likes. He calls it seeing with both your eyes at once, but meaning like holding two perspectives together at the same time, like recognizing that you really do believe in, God, Torah, Judaism, the Brit, the covenant, and also that that's your perspective, like holding that together at the same time.
I see. Now, I'd like to get into Hanukkah a little bit because that is, Levi, why we're talking today. Specifically, in my own limited experience, I do think that some of Rav Shagar's most enlightening teachings on the Chagim come in his works on Hanukkah. You mentioned before the Ha'ir et Patachim, the book of his teachings on Hanukkah, or some of them. You also are the translator of a recent book entitled Living Time, Festival Discourses for the Present Age, which includes 3 essays about Chanukah. So I'm hoping that you can enlighten me and our listeners with some of Rav Shagar's Torah about Chanukah, because as much as we can talk about Rav Shagar's philosophy and the way he saw the universe, to me, and for right now, I really want to hear more about his Torah specifically, some of the teachings that relate directly to right now. Could you help us out?
Okay, so I want to start with like a broad theme in Rav Shagar's Zayne Hanukkah that shows up in some of the different essays, and I think is also underappreciated. Like as you said, we said the book is called Lehair et Ptachim, his Hanukkah drashot. It's not even one of the first books I got of Rav Shagar, but it is like my most worn out book. It is probably my favorite of his collection of drashot, with a close competitor being his book on the Chagim of Iyar, of Yom Yerushalayim, Yom Ha'atzmaut, etc. This book is called Lehair et Ptachim, And I've seen it translated. I think it ended up being translated in like footnotes in the English translations as to illuminate the openings, a sort of mystical sensibility to it. It's actually not how I would translate it. La'ir petachim means to light up the doorways. And Rav Shagar is very fixated on, in some sense, the image of the menorah at the doorway, at the boundary between inside and outside.
Can you talk a little more about why this idea of openings or doorways really is so important? What do you mean by that? And what does Rav Shagar mean? And why did that enthrall him? And what does that have to do with Chanukah specifically, aside from the technical fact that the Chanukah is on the doorway?
Well, the Hanukkah key is at the doorway, but he also notes, in some sense, we shine it outwards, right? Like that is, I think he thinks it's not intuitive that we would make a holiday that is about, reaching out to other people, particularly if they're not necessarily even Jewish, depending where you are in the world, people who are going to see your menorah. In terms of the relationship with Hanukkah, I will say, in the style of Hasidic Torah for generations, it's not always like the clearest what the deep connection between a set of ideas and the holiday is. There's some starting point where they're connected, and then the sort of drasha moves off associatively from there. So in a couple of the drashot I translated, it's the image of candles that begin this larger discussion of self and other, or of mitzvot and authenticity. The in the translation essay, it's the long discourse back to Chazal about Greek wisdom and Greek language and its relationship with Torah. So those are sort of the basic where this comes from. In terms of what I think the image of the doorway is important is because these two questions, in some ways, I'm pointing at, of self and other in an interpersonal sense, and self and other, or inside and outside, in terms of Judaism and the outside world, are, I think, just central issues in what it means to be a Jew alive today. You want to be a person in general, you have to be concerned to have an ethical relationship with other people and about how you do that. And also in terms of, we live in the modern world, or Sugar will call it living in multiple worlds, that we don't ever, he says we don't choose to interact with the outside world as Jews. We are born into both in some sense. We have the outside world inside us before we ever, decide to engage with it, to the point where calling it the outside world is at least a little bit of a misnomer.
Okay. Can you give me some specific ideas about Hanukkah from Rav
Yes.
Shagar? I'm enthralled with everything you're saying. I find it very interesting. I do wonder if, however, people will say you're talking around the ideas. Let's actually get an idea itself. Can you give me a piece of Torah from Rav Shagar about Hanukkah?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been painting the bigger picture, and I think it'll help us to zoom in. The first drasha I translated, one of the first ones I translated Bichlal, but the first of Hanukkah one I translated in Living Time is called "The Candle and the Sacrifice," and it starts off by with a sort of traditional yeshivish lumdish distinction between the Hanukkah candles and the Shabbat candles, and right, and there's halachic questions of, well, whether you have to only get one of them, which one do you prioritize? And Rav Shagar wants to dig down into the nature of the candles and what they represent as like types of religious experiences, and how we experience, kedusha, holiness, and religion in those mitzvot. Right, so the Shabbat candles are specifically lit in places where they will contribute to our lives, in which they'll contribute to Shalom Bayit, to Oneg Shabbat, Kavod Shabbat. Right, they somehow increase and improve our experience of Shabbat. The Hanukkah candles, we say in the song Haner Talalu Kodesh Haim Englan Rishut Hishtamesh Bahem. Right, the holiness of the Hanukkah candles is specifically embodied in our inability to use them. Right, and their, in some sense, uselessness. And so for Rav Shagar, those two models of candles become two models of holiness. Right? There's a section in the essay literally called Two Types of Holiness. One is holiness revealed in meaningfulness, in the moments of fulfillment in our lives, and the way Judaism and Torah make our life feel valuable. It creates good family structure, all kinds of things like that. And the other one Rav Shagar associates with the sacrifice, like with korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, and the way korbanot are not about making life meaningful for the person bringing the korban. And this is specifically built on the model of the korban olah, right? The sacrifice that is burnt up entirely for Hashem, as opposed to ones where people eat part of it. But the image of mitzvot and Torah is something that really makes a demand of us, that requires us to sacrifice something, whether it's anything from money or, in the Beit HaMikdash, an animal, to our time. The real demands that living a religious life makes on the person is itself another mode of Kedusha. And I think sort of historically, in many ways, that I was actually emphasized more, that we often think about Kedusha as uh, sacrificing something for something greater than ourselves, for the Torah, for Hashem. But Rav Shagar also very much comes out of a context in the teachings of Rav Kook, where finding Hashem within our lives is really emphasized. And Rav Shagar says we have to sort of be able to hold these two things together. We have to be able to find Hashem within our lives in the way that the Torah improves our lives and makes life meaningful, but also in the sense that we really do have to sacrifice something sometimes, that there is not just about us. We have to get beyond ourselves as well.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask you about some of the more Kabbalistic or Hasidic ideas of Chanukah that Rav Shagar talks about. Another essay that you translated is Rav Shagar explaining a ma'amar, a statement or an essay really, of the Baal Tanya in Torah or about Chanukah. Could you talk a little bit about some of his Kabbalistic ideas of the candles?
Yeah, so the essay called "A Screen for the Soul, a Garment for the Spirit," I believe, something like that, is about the understanding of the mitzvot in the teachings of the Baal HaTanya, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi. And it's built primarily around one discourse of the Baal HaTanya, but it also looks at some other texts. And he starts from what he calls a sort of, Rav Shagar calls a typical Hasidic meditation on the candles. Right? There's a sense that when the Hasidic Rebbeim were teaching about Hanukkah, they would sort of meditate on the candles and be inspired and go from there. And so the candles that the drashia starts with are two psukim. Ner Hashem Nishmat Hadam, right? The candle of God is the soul of a human being. And Kiner Mitzvah V'Torah Or, that a mitzvah is a candle and Torah is light. So you have two candles. One is the mitzvah, the commandment, and one is the human soul. And for many Hasidic teachers, the ideal best way to be keeping mitzvot is that those two candles should be one and the same. That is where the person should feel burning within them the light of Torah and the force of the mitzvah, that you should just keep mitzvot spontaneously, right? And I always end up, taking Rav Shagar back to Rav Kook. Rav Kook says that if you were really in touch with who you are, sort of deep inside, you would spontaneously keep mitzvot. And so Rav Shagar is responding to that idea. That's how he reads the Chassidut. The Chassidut is the same basic idea. If you were really being authentic, you would just keep mitzvot spontaneously without even ever having heard of Torah. That's what you would do. But the Baal HaTanya wants to articulate a different position, an idea of keeping mitzvot where the soul of man and the power of mitzvah are not identical or overlapping at all. Instead, the Baal HaTanya associates it with the act of Kabbalat Omachut Shemayim, to bring that term back, right? An intentional decision to keep mitzvot. But along the way, he works it into a deep theory of Kabbalistic metaphysics. Right? It says that in the Kabbalistic picture of creation, the world is made of lights and vessels. That God created vessels and filled them with divine light. And the way we typically think about a vessel and its filling is that what really matters, what's important, is what we fill it with, and that the vessel exists for the sake of the thing filling it. And so there is a sense in Kabbalah, if you read certain texts, that like actually the divine light is holier and the vessels are cruder and more material, more solid, right? A vessel, imagine something made of clay, is just infinitely more earthy than light. But the Baal HaTanya points to other texts in Kabbalah and creates a whole theory about how what seems lower is in fact always higher in its divine root, that the vessel is holier than the light that it can hold, and that mitzvot as vessels, as moments where we can fill our lives with divine purpose or something like that, with divine light, the mitzvot in fact are not about the light. The mitzvot are about the being vessels, and that makes them holier than something that would be light, that would be spiritual meaning, something like that. And he connects it to the sfirot, the two sfirot of Chochmah and Keter. Keter being sort of the first sphira on the Kabbalistic tree many people are sort of familiar with. It's the top one. It is literally means the crown. It's associated with the will, with sort of the divine will on some tellings, and then also in ways of thinking of the sphirot as sort of internal to human life as human will. And then he also talks the sphere of Chokhmah, which is the next sphere. The second, it means wisdom, and again, divine wisdom, but also human wisdom. And the way this relates to the mitzvot is that for Chabad, the mitzvot don't come from Chokhmah. They don't come from divine wisdom. God didn't think about the best way to create a human life on earth and then write the Torah and the mitzvot as a what like intricate, proven best plan for life. It's not, human best practices is to be Jewish. They're somehow rooted in the divine will. And will, particularly in Hebrew and Ratzon, means sort of two different things. One, it's what you choose, and also it's what you desire. And there's sort of an ambivalence there. Did Hashem just choose this, or is Hashem somehow even pre-reflecting on it, just desired the mitzvot? Those elements are both sort of in there. The Torah, like Chabad says, the mitzvot come from above thought, from above rational thought. And so the Chabad calls it avodah lamala min hadat. It's a way of getting back before the sin of Eitz Hadat, to sort of connect to a whole other story, that we take up the mitzvot and we preserve the mitzvot, not because of rational, well thought out reasons. And the mitzvot, therefore, because they come from before God's wisdom, which for Chabad is embodied in the Torah, and we encounter it in Torah studying quite directly. But the mitzvah, we directly encounter God's will, which is holier than God's wisdom and higher than God's wisdom in some sense. And for Rav Shagar, that's really important, right? It comes back in that question of what do we choose, and what that's Kabbalat Omachut Shemayim, as choosing to be Jewish and choosing to follow halacha and keep the mitzvot, independent of any sort of spiritual light it might bring into our lives.
I remember reading that for the first time and being really astounded by what he was saying. I know that in that essay, he compares the thought of the Baal Tanya and many Kabbalists with him and the Rambam on the other hand, saying that for the Rambam, wisdom is the highest value, so to speak, in the divine scheme. And therefore, if mitzvot have any value, it's because they make sense. We may never understand them, but they are rooted in the divine wisdom. Whereas for the Baal Tanya and other thinkers like him, it's the other way around. First comes the divine will, the mitzvah, and the reason is secondary. The reason is then fit into that mitzvah after the fact. It doesn't mean it's arbitrary, but it means that you can't say there actually is a reason for the mitzvah because the mitzvah predates, so to speak, the reason itself. The mitzvah is higher than the reason. So if someone were to say, according to that understanding of the Baal Tanya, as Rav Shagar explains it, what is the reason for the mitzvah in God's will? It's not that we don't know, it's that the question doesn't make any sense because it is above the whole concept of rationality. Not that we can't understand it, but that it isn't in that category. It's a category mistake.
Yeah, exactly. That it's not that we don't understand the reason. That there is no reason. It would make no sense to talk about reasons.
But I want to say, though, when we say there is no reason, it's not because it's random. It's based on something higher than reason. For human beings, as I understand Rav Shagar saying this, for human beings, we think of everything through reasoning. We think of things through rationality. However, our scheme of things doesn't obligate God to think that way or to act that way. So therefore, the fact that it's above wisdom doesn't inherently mean that it's random. It's something which is rooted in something which we simply have no access to.
You're right. But I think there is a tendency to say that without really thinking there. I want to make a quick analogy to a different area of theology that I think will help when we come back to it, which is the idea that God is outside of space, right? You ask pretty much any Jew who's thought about God, they will say, right, God doesn't have a body. God is outside of space and time. It doesn't make any sense. But when you say God is outside of space, there's an instinctive reaction to basically imagine God outside of this thing we call space, which necessarily means you put God in a bigger space outside of this space. Right, to say the whole category doesn't apply is means that it's something we can't even imagine. And the same thing is true when we say God is sort of beyond rationality and reason. Meaning we sort of assume, okay, but God has something that's like divine rationality that's not like our rationality.
That would be a mistake here.
Yeah, Rav Shagar is a very explicit in one of his essays on the Holocaust. He has a couple of drashot but for Yom HaShoah. One where he ends up talking quite at length about the Eish Kodesh, the Piaseczner Rebbe, who was lost in Warsaw, unfortunately. But he says there quite strikingly that he says the divine will is meaningless because meaning is a human category, right? It's not that God's will has meaning that we if only our perception were greater we could understand it. Is that God is just beyond that human category. And the same thing would say of rationality, right? That God is beyond this human thing.
So what I'm saying is the flip side of that same thing. I agree with everything you said now. It's also a human category to say that it's random, meaning for us, because we only have those categories of rationality, we'll say it's either makes sense or it doesn't make sense. For God, it's a different category altogether, which doesn't fit into any of those, meaning to say, okay, it's not rational, so therefore it's absurd. That's also wrong. It's not saying it's absurd either. It's in a category that doesn't exist for us.
Right. So I think you're right on the nose there, and I think that this is where I got my own personal sort of hobby horse on. Sister of Shagar should be thought of as what's called a negative theologian, right? That the way we talk about Hashem and our God always has to be basically about saying we don't understand. Both sides of the spectrum, as you put it, don't apply, right? Not meaningful or meaningless. Neither of them are really appropriate to talk about God. The whole category doesn't apply. We sort of constantly put God outside the human.
You and I are speaking the same language now because I often think that the difference between the Rambam's understanding of negative theology and someone like Rav Shagar's, or perhaps we could say the Kabbalists as Rav Shagar understands them, is the Rambam would say we can only say negative attributes. However, those actually tell us something. I would think that ultimately in the postmodern understanding and Rav Shagar's understanding, which I think is based largely on a certain Kabbalistic understanding, even negative attributes don't really tell us anything because there's nothing you can say at all, even the negative.
Right. I think Rambam's a whole other sipur, but I think you're right that like for Rav Shagar, that's what the ayin is about. To bring that term back from earlier, the nothingness, the Kabbalistic nothingness, it functions for Rav Shagar primarily as a sense that God is just beyond us, right? That no matter what we try to articulate, it will necessarily be a human articulation, and therefore, just it doesn't apply to God. It's sort of purely about us, and that there can in fact be some religious value, one, to recognizing that limitation, and occasional moments sort of trying to get outside that even.
Okay, let's move on to the third essay you translated, which is about translation and multiple worlds. I want to ask about this, of course, with the caveat that everyone listening understands there's no substitute to reading the essays either in the original or in translation, but as a basic summary of some of the ideas, could you offer them, Levi, right now?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a phenomenal essay, and in some sense, programmatic for what Rav Shagar is doing as a whole, right? For his, like I said, one of the first things I said, he's known for his engagement with postmodernism. He spent a lot of time engaging with all kinds of philosophy as well, existentialist, analytic, continental, whatever you want to get into. He read widely. He never went to university, though he considered it at a time. But his students would go to university, and he would have them like bring back textbooks and master's theses and anything he could get his hands on. Was an avid reader, so he's deeply engaged with the world of, let's say, knowledge and ideas that are not Torah knowledge and ideas. And it comes through not on every page of his books, but pretty much every drasha or essay, there'll be some mention of something. And sometimes it's just not there until you've read, you don't see it there, but then you read another one where he's doing the same thing and citing the philosopher. And so, oh, you're like, really, the first time he was engaging with this philosopher, he is just all over the place doing that. And so in this essay on translation, he grapples with the relationship between Torah and, the outside world of ideas through the traditional and again Hasidic lens of the relationship between Torah and Chochmat Yavan, right? Greek wisdom and Greek language. And he says that there's one way of thinking about the relationship between Torah and Greek wisdom is that Greek wisdom is a problem, but Greek language is fine, that you're technically allowed to write a Sefer Torah in Greek. So you can, if you are taking Torah ideas, but putting them into secular language, that's fine. You just have to make sure you don't get any secular ideas mixed in with your Torah ideas. But Rav Shagar wants to say the medium is the message. You can't clearly distinguish between Greek language and Greek ideas. And moreover, as I said before, we're all already enveloped in Greek ideas in the secular world all the time. Modern Judaism is deeply individualistic in a way that would be unimaginable to a Jew of 2,000 years ago. And that is something we have to sort of accept and learn to live with. And the same thing is true of sort of our engagement with the modern world more broadly. But he wants, this doesn't lead him to sort of total chaos and letting it all fall together. For him, it means you have to admit there's a relationship within yourself and in the world between the Torah and the outside world. And you have to manage and navigate that consciously. right? So he doesn't want to say, look, you just take Greek language, you put aside Greek ideas. He doesn't think that's possible. You have two languages and you manage the relationship between them. And the relationship between two languages is translation, right? You can translate between them. You can put Torah ideas into secular language, but you have to recognize that is going to necessarily change the ideas in some way. And say more radically, and in this he builds directly off of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov talks about translation for a much broader Kabbalistic metaphysics and discourse, but in Torah 19 of Likutei Moharan, and there he says, "Ikar binyana v'shlemota shel lashon hakodesh." The primary building up and perfection or completion of the holy language is through translation, translating external ideas into Jewish language. And we just had in Parshat Vayetze, so Lavan and Yaakov create a sort of border between them and set up a pile of stones as a marker or a monument to their covenant. And before the Torah tells us what Yaakov is going to call it, he tells us that Lavan calls it Yagar Sahaduta, followed by Yaakov calling it Gal Ed, both of which mean in their different languages pillar witness and they're a stone witness. And so that Yaakov essentially, for Rabbi Nachman and for Rav Shagar, is translating Lavan's idea into Hebrew, into the holy language, into Judaism, right? They're bringing ideas from the outside in. One transforms those ideas. It's important to say, but Rav Shagar has a footnote where he says Rav Kook read Kant like a yeshiva bacher. But he says you have to recognize that's what we're doing, and there is in fact some important value to this. There is some value for Torah in bringing ideas from the outside in.
Okay, very interesting. And thank you for offering those words of Torah about Chanukah from Rav Shagar. I want to ask you about what you said a moment ago. Obliquely, you said that he didn't go to university, and I'm guessing part of that reason was because he was in the Israeli army. And in fact, from what I understand, one of the formative moments, if not the formative moment in his life, was the Yom Kippur War, where he was injured while serving in a tank. And I think some of his comrades were actually killed, some of his friends, either in his tank or in his unit. And that really had a major, major effect on the way that he saw the world, at least from what I've read. So I want to ask you a little bit before we conclude about taking some of these ideas of Rav Shagar and how it affects his understanding of the state of Israel. Today we have a collection of Rav Shagar's writings in a book called Riti Shalom. It's a relatively recent work which puts together a lot of his thinking about the state of Israel today. We also have his book, as you mentioned before, the book on Moedei Iyar, that talks about the holidays of Iyar, Yom HaAtzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, dealing with also a lot about the state of Israel today. We don't know what Rav Shagar would say about the current war. We don't know what Rav Shagar would say about the current situation. He died close to 2 decades ago. Nevertheless, we can speculate a little bit, even though that's dangerous. Could you just talk a little bit, Levi, about Rav Shagar's attitude towards the modern state of Israel in a way that might relate directly to how we see things today?
So I think you're rooting in his experience of the Yom Kippur War is good and important. He thought there was a sort of sea change in Zionism after that, and I think his picture is in many ways one-sided. He thought that he emphasizes the rise of what was called post-Zionism, sort of an Israeli movement in the 80s and 90s. And he says, look, you see this change is happening in Zionism. We have to somehow grapple with that. But this is the same time period that saw the rise of Gush Emunim and fervent right-wing Zionism. So it's not as simple as Rosh Hashanah is painting it, but he has this very powerful description. It was his student Rav Chanan Nir says that Rav Shagar told him when Rav Shagar was in the burn ward in Haifa in the Rambam hospital there for a couple of months, recovering from his injuries in the Yom Kippur War, he had this sense, this realization that just as he was hospitalized and in bandages, the Torah was somehow hospitalized and in bandages, and that when he was going to leave the hospital, he had to bring the Torah out of its bandages and into the light of the world.
What does that mean that the Torah is in bandages?
So it's not so easy to understand exactly what he meant. The way I understand it is looking at the world the way it really is, and looking at the Torah the way it shapes our life is an important idea for Rav Shagar. Like looking at the Torah the way it is, but I think also the state. He's very concerned that the state of Israel is often thought of in religious terms that are fully disconnected from its reality. Right. So one thing he points to just corruption within the apparatus of the state, or there are people who are important members of government, and he's having talking about this going back to the 80s, but through when he died in 2007, right? You could at many points in time point at different Israeli governing ministers and people in different institutions that are corrupt. Like it happens in any government, but exactly that, the fact that the state of Israel and the government of Israel function like any government means that talking with the state of Israel as the embodiment of the Davidic dynasty or the Malchut Yisrael, right, Jewish kingship, something like that, at the very least grates and is a contradiction. He doesn't use language like saying like it's ridiculous, but he would say that you're not looking at reality, right? And he says if in some ways Hashem speaks to us through reality, or Hashem is in control of history and reality to some degree, like you have to take seriously the events that you lay of your life and what the real institutions and people you're looking at are.
So did he believe that the state of Israel has religious value?
So he never says the state of Israel has no religious value, right? That would be a strong statement he doesn't make. He has different statements he makes over time. He's very uncomfortable associating it with redemption, though in a couple of places he talks about even if it can't be a full realization of our hopes for redemption, it could still be a midinat tzedek, right? A state of justice that will sort of manifest or embody the vision of the prophets. The later prophets of Tanakh who speak about justice and caring for the poor and downtrodden, thinks the state could do that. His strongest statement in this regard comes from after the Hitnatkut, the disengagement. He died not too long afterwards, but we have a flurry of texts that he wrote around that time, right before and during the Hitnatkut. Rav Shagar, who had been very reluctant to publish, suddenly became very interested in publishing for a broader audience. Where before his students had to convince him to give them his drafts and they would turn it into something publishable. He started writing short essays and drashot for religious Zionist periodicals like Nekuda and Hatzofeh. And in these texts, he is really trying to grapple with exactly these questions. And where before he said, look, the way the state is acting or the way certain people in the state are acting make it hard to associate with redemption. Around the Hitnatkut, he starts to give a hope at any state in the sense of a modern state, which is a centralized lawmaking body that enforces the law using the violent means at its what it has available to it. He says that doesn't sound like redemption to me. Right? He says, what we hope for is something much greater than that. And so his probably strongest statement is at the end of an essay called Lo nitzachnu be'amona. We didn't win in Amona. He says the religious solution to the modern moment, or the way we need to think about religion and redemption in the moment is in a communitarian sense. We need to turn to the community, to the kihila, and sort of the traditional Jewish political entity of galut, of exile, right? For 1,000+ years in exile, Jews lived in kihilot, in communities, and that was where your religious life centered. He says that's what we should be doing now, even in the state of Israel. Our religious life centers on our religious community, not on the state. The state cannot be the object or core of religious life. Religious life is about being part of the religious community. And also you could be Zionist separately from that, right? He says we'll still thrill when we hear Hatikvah. It'll still send a shiver down our spines, but the state is not a religious thing in that sense. He doesn't say the state has no religious value. Like that's a strong, direct statement he doesn't quite make.
Would you consider him a religious Zionist? Perhaps not in the sense that it means politically right now, but generally as we've used that term for the past 100 years.
I write about Rav Shagar in English, so it creates interesting opportunities that aren't available in Hebrew. And so when writing about him in English, I will frequently say he's a religious Zionist with a small r, as opposed to religious Zionist with a capital R, capital Z, which is like the religious Zionist community in Israel today, right? He is Zionist and he's religious. And over the course of his life, those two are related in different ways, right? His religiosity and his Zionism. But he's not, he's very much born within today's religious Zionist community, and grows from within it, but he very much disagrees with it on so many points that I think it's not, I wouldn't call him as a religious Zionist as capital R, capital Z. He's a smaller religious Zionist.
Okay, interesting. Now, as I said before, I'm going to ask you to speculate, Levi. So forgive the question, but we're going through very, very difficult times right now with a war which is continuing. God willing, it will end soon with the return of the hostages and hopefully at least some time where we can live quietly and live our own lives without worrying about our borders so much. What do you think Rav Shagar would have to say about the current moment if you could take what you've learned from him and try to apply it to the current political moment, the current military moment? If you could guess, it's nothing more than a guess, but if you could guess, what do you think some of his attitudes would be towards the war and towards the current reality of Israel?
So I'm going to say a couple of different things. The first is does have some discussion of war in British Shalom, and sort of based on the little bit he says there was not extensive. I think he would probably, despite his real aversion to violence, is very sensitive to violence and force, and is not a fan of them. He would say like there's such a thing, I think, as a just war. It might only be a defensive war. He even points out the way Rambam is maybe critical of a preemptive war. So, but you've been attacked, you can respond, I think is something he would be on board with. But given that, I want to say a couple of other things. One is that a theme I've mentioned before, and I see throughout his writings, is the importance of looking reality as it is, right? No obfuscation. Don't deny things that make you uncomfortable.
What would that mean now? What would that mean today?
I mean, today is the question of, have Israeli soldiers committed war crimes of whatever scale? And the answer could never be impossible. They're people. Presumably, some of them are better than others within the army. The army is made up of people. You have to actually investigate and look at what people have done and determine the proper way of responding to that. You can't set it aside in advance. And I would build off that even in there's a drasha he refers to multiple times throughout Briti Shalom. We're talking about the relationship in the Israeli left and the Israeli right. And he's someone who through most of his life identified with the Israeli right. There's one text from around the Hitnatkut where he calls for the creation of a new left party, which will be a true prophetic left, not a bourgeois left like Meimad, which Rav Amital's left-wing party that Rav Shagar himself was a part of for a time. And this is at the very end of the essay on law and love, something like that, in Living Time. There's another phrase he'll refer to. Like I said, he identified with sort of the Israeli right, both to whatever degree politically, but certainly as part of the cultural right of the religious Zionist community. And he says, when he talks about the way he feels like the secular majority has treated the religious minority, he quotes the drasha about the pasuk "Vayiru otanu hamitzrim" or "Vayu mitzrim et Yisrael." It says that the Torah says Mitzrim treated the Jews badly, Vayiru otam, right? But the drasha that Rav Shagar cites reads it as they made us ra, they made us bad, not they did bad to us, they made us bad, and that in some ways primary concern Rav Shagar has with the way that the religious Zionist minority responds to real mistreatment from the left-wing secular majority throughout, say, the Oslo years, something like that, is that we will give up on our moral position and take a position of defensiveness, and they attacked us, so it's fine for us to get back at them and to treat them the way they treat us and stuff like that. And like the same thing is true in any war. Any war presents the possibility of being so hurt and mistreated, and like really those are true things that happen, that you lose all sense of the necessity of moral restraint. You become incapable of asking hard moral questions, which again doesn't mean that there's an obvious answer to determine in advance, but you have to be able to have that conversation and be self-critical. And I think he would emphasize that as well.
That's really important. I appreciate that. To conclude, Levi, we have two books that have been written in English, at least two that I know of. One of them is your translation, Living Time, Festival Discourses for the Present Age, as well as another book, both published by Maggie. This one was published about 7 years ago, Faith Shattered and Restored, Judaism in the Postmodern Age. For those people who can read Hebrew, and there's a very large library, over 20 books of Hebrew Rav Shagar books, could you give, apart from these English works, which obviously are a good place to start, could you give a good starting place? If someone says, I don't even know where to begin, I'd like to start learning some Rav Shagar, what would you recommend that person start with?
It's a good question. I always say it really depends on sort of what people are looking for. I love the drashot for the Chagim. Like the reason that the book I translated was a collection of Drashot for the Chagim is that first I should say I should give a shout out to other people involved in this process. This was actually the impetus of an initiative of Professor Alan Brill. It was his idea at first. And then later, Eitan Abramovich, who was the editor from the Machon L'Kitvei Rav Shagar. They are both wonderful and both involved in various ways. The initial text selection, where we got our basis, Alan said to me, well, what text would you want to teach? You're going to pick what you think are like the most important texts. What are they? And I gave him a whole list. And it just happened to be like, not all of them, but the majority of them were the drashot for the Chagim. So like, I think the drashot for the Chagim are incredible. I said, I think the Chanukah book is my favorite, followed shortly by the by Yom Ahu, the one for Moedei Iyar, for Yom Ha'atzmaut, Yom Yerushalayim, etc. And so that's a big recommendation. If you're looking for more sort of theoretical essays dealing with postmodernism, but also broader topics, then the place to go is Luchot V'Shivrei Luchot, the big 400-page book on a variety of a whole list of topics. Some great essays in there. Anyone doing that, my favorite essay in there, one of my favorite essays in general, called Education and Ideology. Great text. Very parallel to the halacha ve'emunah essay mentioned in here, translated as a religious life in the modern era in Faith Shattered and Restored. But also, I say, like, he has drashot on not drashot, like lectures he gave on Likutei Moharan that are very accessible and in many ways less philosophically focused. There's not, and there's plenty of philosophy in those ones, but there's not quite as much of a focus on in regards to language. I think a lot of people really love his lectures on Likutei Moharan. I think they're great. They're just not my favorite. And like there's so many things we could keep talking about. The last thing I'll mention is people who are not philosophy people or Chassidut people in general, but want something new in like their study of Gemara, for instance. They're putting out in volume after volume of his shiurim on Gemara. So far, they have a small volume on sugyot having to do with Shemitah, but also a volume on Rosh Hashanah, Yoma, and Sukkot, and 2 volumes on Masechet Brachot. There's a volume on Sanhedrin in the works, and those are great in general, and specifically if you're a Gemara fan.
I've been reading his Chidushim on Masechet Brachot, Volume 2, which really deals with Hilchot Tefillah, and it's fascinating. It's a different way of learning Gemara that I'm used to, and I find it very, very enlightening. I definitely appreciate that. Rabbi Levi Morrow, this has been really interesting, and going into Chanukah, I really wanted to get a sense of Rav Shagar, because I agree with you, his essays on Chanukah are just out of sight. They're really among my very favorites of the things that he's written, and along with that, Rav Shagar offers a corrective to some of the dominant narratives that we have in the religious Zionist world today. Not that those narratives are necessarily wrong. People are welcome to think them. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with them either. But it's important to understand, in my mind, L'Hagdil Torah Ul Hadira, to make Torah great and glorious, to open up people to the possibility that there are other ways of thinking. Sometimes we get so indoctrinated into certain ways of understanding what religious Zionism is, frankly, what Judaism is, that we don't realize that within the Torah world, there are different approaches that we may not have considered before, but are perfectly valid within a Torah context. To me, Rav Shagar offers a completely complementary and yet different way of understanding some of these basic ideas, which is important for people to access and to realize are out there. And I thank you today for offering our listeners such wonderful ideas. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Chanukah Sameach. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.